time, the Russians were unlucky and couldn't enter the town. But they started to flank the town using old tanks. This tank was destroyed by a single drone. And now look, this Russian tank was hit, and the crew abandoned it. A minute later, the tank exploded. Most Russian tanks are of such low quality that just one drone hit makes them explode like a firecracker. Here's one more example. This might be the most powerful tank explosion in the entire history of the war. Look at this ironic story. The Russians spotted a Ukrainian Abrams tank and hit it very accurately. After the hit, besides some light smoke, we don't see anything. The Abrams tank probably received very minor damage and can be restored. The Russians used their most powerful artillery shell, the Krasnopol. This shell is launched by the long-range howitzer 2S5. It is a self-guided projectile with a shaped charge warhead. But look, it couldn't destroy the Abrams tank. This tank can definitely be repaired and serve again in the Ukrainian army. Later, the Russians also struck the tank with an FPV drone, but again without success. And now, for comparison, take a look at the new Russian tank T-90. Ukrainians used a cheap drone with a regular warhead against it, and as you can see, the Russian tank turned into scrap metal in a matter of seconds. This story vividly demonstrates the quality of Western tanks compared to Russian tanks. In fact, Russian tanks have numerous problems, but you probably already know the most crucial one. It lies in the approach to tank building by Russian engineers. Russians always prefer quantity over quality. It's easier for them to produce thousands of cheap tanks than to bother with ensuring the safety of the crew. Here's another example of how a small drone incinerates a new Russian tank. And now, take a look at this example. A well-protected Russian tank encounters a Ukrainian FPV drone. At first it seemed like nothing happened, but after a few minutes, the tank caught fire and exploded. Also, it's very ironic that even the most protected Russian tank is absolutely defenseless when its crew leaves it with an open hatch. Russians have spent a lot of effort and time developing methods to protect tanks from drones. But all of this is meaningless when the hatch cover remains open. And a grenade dropped into the tank's turret is capable of penetrating the bottom of the Russian tank. It's interesting that while creating a protective structure above the tank turret, Russian designers don't bother to make it slightly wider to cover the hatch opening. As a result, a single cheap grenade once again destroys an expensive Russian tank. Look, this tank has a special anti-drone protective metal net installed, but the crew left it open just like the hatch cover. The result turned out to be the same. Inside, Russian tanks are lined with easily flammable materials, so they always burn well. And of course, if there is at least one ammunition left inside, sooner or later it explodes. All of this leads to the fact that when Russian soldiers advance, they fear their own tanks, which can explode at any moment more than they fear Ukrainian artillery. Can you imagine how powerful the American M67 hand grenade is? Ukrainians use such grenades to hit Russian tanks from the air. This grenade guarantees to ignite the Russian tank from the inside, but in this tank, almost all of its ammunition remained unused. Therefore, the ignition led to an extremely powerful explosion. The explosion was so powerful that the tank was torn into pieces of scrap metal, and even the nearby tank standing next to it caught fire and was also destroyed. But take a look at this upgraded Russian tank now. Notice that Russians mark with a red star only their best tanks. Russians considered this tank so cool that they deployed it on the battlefield even without the protective metal grill net from drones. This tank has a new turret with ultra-strong dynamic protection, which is almost impossible to penetrate. Additionally, the tank is equipped with a new anti-drone system. Therefore, if it weren't for the open hatch cover, the tank would have remained undamaged. But look at how the ammunition inside the tank explodes. And notice that despite the detonation of the ammunition, the tank's turret remains in place. This means that the Russians have improved their new tanks by borrowing some principles from Western technologies. However, to ramp up mass production of such tanks, Russians will need much more time. Nevertheless, despite the huge losses, the Russians continue to advance thanks to their numerical superiority. The Ukrainians simply can't destroy all the Russian armored vehicles quickly enough. Ukraine continues to successfully attack military targets in Russian territory. Recently, a Ukrainian drone traveled over 1,200 kilometers and attacked the factory producing Iranian drones, Shahid. When the Russians were dealing with the aftermath of the destruction at their factory, they found remnants of the Ukrainian drone. It was so large that some thought it was a full-sized aircraft. Take a look. The Ukrainian drone has a wingspan of 5 meters and a warhead weighing 300 kilograms. The Russians did not expect Ukraine to deliver such a devastating blow. Russian-Iranian drones are causing significant damage to Ukrainian cities, so Ukrainians justified striking the Russian factory in response. The US government has called on Ukraine to stop bombing targets in Russian territory, but Ukraine continues to